Hey everybody, welcome to the Growing with Fishes podcast, episode 155. It's a really cool episode. We did a similar episode like this a few months, or a few weeks, few months ago, whatever it's been at this point. I forget after how many episodes we've had. I think it was like 138 or 139. So it's maybe 20 or so episodes ago, but thanks a lot for everyone for taking the time to join us. We have Beth Schechter, formerly from Open Cannabis Project.
Hello, it's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Hello, welcome back.
Welcome back. Thanks for coming. And we'll be seeing you again next week too, I think.
Yeah, I'm really excited, and we'll maybe talk about that a little bit later after introductions or something.
Awesome.
Cool.
And then we'll also have SungrownMidz. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me.
Guys done a lot to help the cannabis community over the last few months. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't know a lot of things that we know currently. And I think a lot of the people's lives would be different even on this panel right now. So, and we have Dale Hunt, who works very hard with helping the cannabis industry. Thanks a lot for joining us. Oh, you're muted. Want to introduce yourself, Dale? We'll get you. See if I can figure it out. All right. We'll get back to Dale in a minute. He's having some technical issues, I guess. We also have Eleanor.
Can Dale not hear you again?
Are we having issues again with Dale?
Just to make sure.
Possibly. We had some issues earlier. We'll get it going. We have Eleanor Kuntz. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Go ahead. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I work for LeafWorks, which is a genetics company. We focus on botanical identification in all plants. So we work in the natural product space, which includes cannabis in our world. Cannabis is just another one of the many plants we love. And I also am co-founder of Candor, the Cannabis Herbarium, which is an herbarium documenting cannabis.
Awesome. We also have Roger from ILGM.
How's everybody doing tonight? And welcome back to all of you to the show, and welcome to you new people to the show. Very nice to have you, and get a great topic tonight. I can't wait.
Oh yeah. And we have Tara Lee live.
Good evening. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Oh, there's Dale. Oh, we got
working
you.
now. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the audio was out for a minute, but I'm back.
Why don't you introduce yourself there, Dale?
Okay. I am a plant scientist and patent attorney. I work with plant breeders and a lot of other different kinds of inventors in cannabis, agriculture, clean water, alternative energy, all those kinds of things. And my law firm is called Plant and Planet.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, there's a lot to talk about. A lot of things have changed in the last even, I guess, 2 or 3 months since we had the last episode on this topic. So there was some events earlier in the year that led to a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear in the industry and a lot of but one of the side effects of it, and I think one of the wonderful side effects of it, was the fact that it really brought the industry together. Everyone kind of stopped fighting so much and was like, hey, how do we all work together to protect ourselves? Because if we don't, we're screwed. And there's a lot of things that have happened in that realm, and I thought we could kind of get together and talk about that kind of as a general topic, and how we can, what has happened in the last few months. I guess we can start off with whoever wants to go first. I know Beth has a lot to say, and I also know SunGrownMidz is a lot as far as done a lot of digging on different things going on. So whoever wants to take the helm first, feel free. Or if anyone else has something that they want to bring up first, please do.
Well, I suggest Beth go first, and she's got to pop off the earliest. So.
Well, go ahead.
Cool, thanks. So first, hi, and thanks again, Steve, for bringing people together and having these conversations. Conversations are actually kind of, that's kind of all that I've signed myself up for this summer, and some writing, in part because, well, one, people have been really coming to me and others who have been part of the Open Cannabis Project. And we've really been getting a lot of a sense of like, we're sad that OCP is gone. What could we do to have something different? Like, what's the next plan? Like, what's the next step? And, that is, there's a lot of hope there, and I'm really excited about that. And I also feel like it's really important as a first step to make sure that we are really taking a moment to like examine ourselves, examine our ethics, take a look at how we did things before, and think about new ways to figure things out. And so to that end, I've been having a series of conversations, like basically since the last time we talked, and since OCP has closed, I've been having a series of conversations that started on June 11th with some people in Portland and a few people online, really kind of talking rather broadly about ethics and cannabis and what that could look like. And the conversation, I've learned some hard lessons about audio in both live and online recorded things. So I have like this one video where you can hear everybody on the computer, but you can't hear everybody in the room. And I have this other video where like you can't hear the people on the computer, but you can hear the people. So I have to like figure that out. And so because that was kind of a mess, but a great conversation, and we talked pretty broadly about, and there's like only like 14 people who were in the room, and then about 5 people who showed up online. Josh and Kelly from Dragonfly were there online. They were some of the few people who actually like held through to the very end, which was kind of amazing because you kind of, from my understanding, that the technology didn't work and you couldn't hear anything. So I'm sorry about that. And then in the room we had folks, let's see who was there. Angela Baca, who has helped out with a lot of Open Cannabis Project stuff. A grower who I'd not met before named Clay, who's really sweet. And mostly like basically 14 people from Portland all showed up. We talked about ethics, and it was a relatively broad statement. And since then, the conversation for some of us has really shifted to, well, okay, so we can't make a giant statement of ethics or whatever that can cover the whole cannabis industry. We can't enforce it, so, and of course people want something that has teeth in it. That's something I hear again and again. And so in the past few weeks, the way I've been really reframing the question in my head is, if Open Cannabis Project was to, rebuild and reform, or an organization like that was to rebuild and reform, like what would it look like? What would its governing principles be? Because we might not be able to create some sort of broad statement that can affect a whole industry, but we might be able to build something that can affect an organization. And in some ways that sort of sets the tone for like, in some ways, redoing the work that OCP should have done at the beginning, and it didn't happen. And here we are. And, it's kind of volcanic soil that's sort of like ready and fertile for something new, so we can build it. So next week I'm looking to have a workshop. I was initially going to do like another big workshop and try to sort of redo the same kind of like open discussion, but I realized after talking to Steve and to some other people that it might be what might be the most useful, and I'd love to hear feedback from people in the group, is to have a conversation that's like maybe making a point to make sure that we bring in somebody like Adam Dunn, perhaps, if he's listening, or people who are really leaders in the breeding community, along with some scientists, along with a few like lawyers and policy people, to really look through these questions and issues in a really tailored way, and to create online participation that way. So we're looking to do that next week. And the goal, and to have that on the show, which, thank you again, Steve, for offering the space for this. I think it's great. That's such a great way to help. It really helps me with the technology piece where I need help, and it also helps to get the word out to people and to be really open and transparent while also being inclusive, because it's hard. You do such a great job of managing a whole bunch of people online, and that's not. You make it look easy, and it's not actually all that easy. And so from there, the goal is to there's some writing that needs to be done by the end of July. Some folks have asked that I put together basically a chapter for the Routledge what is it called? The Rutledge Handbook for Interdisciplinary Research in Cannabis or something like that. And the idea is to put together a chapter based on some of these discussions that we're having around ethics as a sort of call to action to continue this as a place of study, because it's a place of very needed study. And so from there, we hopefully will have a drafted statement of ethics by HempFest, open to public review. And then my new goal is to have a final draft by Emerald Cup for us to review together. And so in that time frame, I'm giving us plenty of time because, because time moves faster than we think it will. And we all have, jobs and we have to pay our bills. And I'm trying to be good and balanced and whole and all that kind of good stuff. So I'm hoping to have a series of discussions between now and throughout the rest of the year that will really help to shape this practice. And the idea and the hope is that these conversations will really result in the kind of structure that's necessary to run a really ethical and community-focused organization. So that's what I've got. That's what I've been working on, and I'm interested in thoughts and ideas from everybody on this panel and elsewhere.
That's great. That's great to hear. You're doing that, getting a book out so that people can actually have somewhere to go and find this information you're working on. So, yeah, if you're gonna, I don't know how I could help, but I'll help. If you got anything for me to do, I'll help you out.
Well, that's awesome. And I mean, so that's great. One, I appreciate the offer. And two, I think that one of the things that we had done at OCP is we'd made a whole bunch of surveys. And of course, we made all these sort of surveys and then we closed. And not to say that I would necessarily even want to use the same questions, but I think that there's, in addition to just wanting to hear your thoughts and for you to reach out to me anytime and know that my door is open, my hope is to try and collect a lot of different responses from as many people as possible with regards to some of these ethical questions. So I'll be putting that together in the next week before the workshop next week. And it would be great if you and anybody else that who you think wants to have their voice heard in this to either, send me a note or fill out the survey that we put out or something, because I really am looking to make this as inclusive of a process as possible. And, from the perspective of somebody who's still working part-time and working out of my house in Portland, Oregon on a small, but, a small budget kind of thing.
Well, let's make sure we have a link to that survey and I can put it on our website,
Awesome.
Let our members, let our members that want to be involved or at least do the survey.
Cool.
Because there's a lot of people out there breeding and all, and I don't know, I can't speak for Josh, but we can maybe reach out to the Regenerative Cannabis Conference members too.
We'll get it out there. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
I appreciate that. On the show as well.
Awesome.
What are some of the other panelists thinking?
Hi, this is Trevor, SungrownMidz. I'll jump in. It's been pretty interesting going through the whole Phylos thing. It's a story that won't end. I mean, just last week, Robert Clark resigned from the board. And it's a story that kind of shouldn't end. This is essentially, in my mind, Phylos, all of the other entities that they are kind of a metaphor and stand-in for at this point, really represent the alternative model between a historical sort of cultural cannabis that we've all known and been a part of, and the big ag takeover and corporate takeover of cannabis. And so I feel like this year, the coming years kind of need to continue to put this issue and how we're going to move forward in terms of building alternatives at the forefront of really everything that we're doing. There are multiple different facets. There's, this is largely the genetics sort of element of the discussion, but, it's broad-based. It takes up every aspect of cannabis, be it cultivation practices like what's being done in the regenerative cannabis movement, what's going on in terms of, with Phylos, genetics, breeding, etc. The issues with, in California, my reference point is always California for everybody, sorry, but the issues that we're dealing with in terms of supply chain issues, bottlenecks, the lack of storefronts, the fact that Oklahoma in 6 months has more dispensary space, which is something I just heard, than all of California is batshit crazy. And so there's a lot of fights on a lot of fronts, but they all coalesce into the same issue. And that is protecting and preserving heritage cannabis as we know it, and what we've all kind of been about our entire lives. So there's a lot of really good stuff that's going on in that area. And we have to figure out a multitude of different alternatives and methods for dealing with the situation that we're confronted with. They need to be commercial. They need to be also outside of the commercial space. I don't know. Is my voice coming through weird? Is there bad feedback for everybody?
Sounds okay to me. There's something phasing a little bit, but you sound fine. I can understand you myself.
Okay. I'm not getting any feedback on my end.
Okay, cool. We just finished up the Appalachia Working Group here in California. It's been a series of different meetings with state bureaucrats and with different cannabis organizations from across the state and different representatives. There have been people who are representing banned counties. There are people who are representing counties with regulations. And really the interesting thing that California has done through the Appalachia system is created in statute a mandate for the creation of an Appalachia program, which would essentially create standards, practices, cultivars, and varietals that get protected within a particular geographic location. And this provides us really unique potentials. And I think that we need to come together, make sure that this system is a robust system that really has teeth in terms of setting standards and creating community-based IP essentially, because Appalachians are intellectual property. They're governed under the WIPO, the World Internet Intellectual Property Organization, and it's part of the Lisbon Treaty, at least at the international law level. This framework is one that, because it's including cultivars, actually creates a framework for us to protect our genetics, because it creates standards and practices. It creates a protection for our cultivation methods and for our historical locations for cultivation. Because to be perfectly honest, we don't cultivate in traditional agricultural zoned properties and areas. We're not growing cannabis by and large historically in fields in the Central Valley here in California. We've been growing in the river canyons of the backwoods. And so the unique properties of the environments and the standards and practices that we've employed across the county or across the state and different counties are unique, and that's a large part of the different unique heritage of California cannabis. And I think the Appalachian system, something that we really like, everybody needs to read up on it, look into it, and like we need to link up across the state, because it's going to take a community effort of people both in their local jurisdictions and across the state to work together, because we have to build up the science to demonstrate and prove that there's a connection and a distinction between a particular cultivar grown in Calaveras County relative and a particular place in Calaveras County relative to other places in the county or other places across the state or globally. And this is what's going to create protections for, as cannabis becomes legally, federally legal, internationally legal. If we hope to protect community-based traditional cultural production methods, this is how we're going to do it. And it's international in scope. It's going to ideally protect people in the Kif mountain range in Morocco, in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and throughout all of the rest of the world where there are traditional producers who can access similar protections. And it needs to be something like GI geographic indicators are a very valuable tool for us to protect our intellectual property. And this system, the fact that it's coming online and the state has been so receptive to our input, is something that I think is very heartening. And that's just one of many, many things. There's open source ideas that are coming from different people. There's discussions around, well, I mean, in 2 days, there's going to be the launch of CAPS Forum, the Bean Basement.nl. I think it's really important that we start to move towards forums that are built by members of the community and are really something that, you know, we don't need to be on IG and all these other platforms that censor us, delete us, and block us from their platforms and undermine our ability to engage with people and build social communities and social networks, and having healthy dialogues as well, because we know there are issues there.
Oh yeah, we had Cannabis on just recently.
I was also going to say Cannabis and Strainly are the two others that we really like. We need to get together with all of these different platforms and use them. And one thing about, like, I think the open source language, like ideas, we need to think more about open source licensing and what's going on there. The Germans are doing it. Apparently 2 people have applied for open source licensing protection for cannabis varieties. I don't know anything about it, so I'm no expert. I'm just hearing this secondhand from people who know a lot more about it. And Beth, I think you know. Dale, you may know more. Other panelists should probably talk on that stuff. But I think we also need to, like, it's paramount for us to look into in-housing our data collection. And the most important thing that we could probably do or get from outside community sources, particularly coders, is open source software for phenotype and pedigree data. I've looked up, like, there's lots of different universities who have different source code. I'm not a coder. I don't understand this stuff. But if we had a very simple series of spreadsheets, essentially, which are just different data entry fields of pedigree information, phenotype data, plot charts, and environmental data that could be input passively, ideally, like, those right there would be the data entry tools that we need to do all the same sort of applied breeding techniques that advanced breeders have been doing for decades before they got, you know, molecular genomics. Like, we could still have the same tools and have the same sort of predictive ability, map our populations, understand them in detail, describe them and define them in detail, and use that data and all of that data collection for whatever protections we need to do, be it through the Appalachia system, or if breeders want to pursue patent protections or open source licensing, they would have all the information through this open source software that would all be data that they could collect in-house, share, optimize, do however they want to do internally without being reliant on these, you know, outside data pirates, because that's what we're now confronted with, is data piracy on a massive level. And yeah, I'll cede the floor. Sorry for taking up time, but that's a lot of things I've been thinking about.
Well, I'll speak up if it's okay. You mentioned a few things that are important to me. One of the things I would love to see is for the US system to be more compatible with some kind of open source system for sharing cannabis genetics conditionally, sharing it only with people who are willing to play by certain rules. And one of the things I've pointed out in other forums is that the biggest problem with open source as a concept in cannabis is that, well, the way to illustrate the problem is to distinguish between plant rights and copyrights. Open source is a model that works really well with software, but part of that is as soon as you create software, you have a copyright in it. You don't have to do anything to to establish that right. The right exists as soon as you create the software. And in contrast, if you create a new cultivar, if you do a new cross and you create something, there is no automatic right analogous to a copyright. If you want to obtain that right, it's available, but you have to file for it, you have to pay for it, you have to wait for it. And if there were a system of some kind of automatic or natural rights for plant breeders as to the things that they create, then it would make it a lot more workable to have an open source system, because you'd have some rights and you'd have some legal recourse without having to go through all the trouble of registering. And people might say, and I've heard people say this, well, if every single cross, every single product of a sexual cross is an original genetic combination, then the breeder would be creating rights on a massive scale. And that's true, but it doesn't mean that all of those rights are going to be enforced or that all of those rights will become part of an open source system. With automatic copyright, it might be crazy to think about this, but every text you send, as soon as you put something original, and some of your text might not be very original, but as soon as you put an original work into some kind of recorded form, some kind of preserved form, even as ephemerally preserved as a text, that has copyright on it. So the volume of this isn't such a big deal because it's already common with copyright. Every single original work you create, whether you just do a sketch on a napkin in a bar, that is copyrighted as soon as it's created. So of course the issue is that they're only going to be some small fraction of what the breeder has natural rights to that would end up in an open source system, that would end up even being commercialized or commercially relevant. So I guess one of my goals for this year is to try to keep that conversation going and establish a dialogue with policymakers and with other rabble-rousers so that we can at least explore the possibility of legislation that would establish something like that. It was certainly the near universal copyright upon creation was established through legislation. Before that, it was more like plant breeders' rights are now. You had to register your copyright instead of just having it upon creation of the work. So that's one thing. The other thing that is kind of a goal of mine for the community is just this kind of three-prong commitment that I think a lot of us have made personally and in whatever organizations we're part of. But I would like it to be, I guess, more widespread and kind of the special handshake of people who are playing by good ethics in the cannabis industry or the cannabis community. And that is, the three prongs are transparency and accountability and trust. And of course, the trust comes after the first two. But if we think about, Phylos is just one example, but we think about people in the industry that we know have problems knowing whom to trust. It's really unclear sometimes knowing whom to trust. There are lots of reasons for that. But I think if we could help everyone around us to understand the importance of transparency. If we're not being transparent, or if those whom we're working with are not transparent, that's already a red flag. And we should be demanding transparency and be bold enough to have some conversations about transparency. After transparency comes accountability. Are you really being as transparent as you claim to be? And how do we hold you accountable? How do you hold yourself accountable? And that's one of the things that I also want to advocate for is companies and organizations creating a constitution of some sort, putting it out there and saying, these are the rules that we will govern ourselves by and that we will live by. And we're inviting all of our partners and colleagues and competitors and critics to look at these rules and hold us accountable to living by these rules and tell us if they think our rules ought to be different. that kind of transparency coupled with accountability, I think, can help us establish a new kind of trust in the industry, at least help us identify whom we should trust. And that's all, that's just kind of talk right now. But I think we could translate it into some standards that we would want to hold each other to and insist upon from those that we work with.
Wonderful.
I'll mute.
Did you have any comments on that? Did you have anything?
I don't get to be involved in it, so I'm not commenting on that kind of stuff. I'm more listening to hear what everybody else's opinion is tonight, the best I can. So.
Oh. Go ahead. All right. I was just go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to jump in and just speak to a little bit about what Trevor was saying about really taking stock of where we're at and what the community does hold and how the community can protect that information. So I come to the party as a botanist. So that's my background, and I'm a population geneticist. So I have a very different background in some sense, but a very similar background in others, where I think it's important for us to realize all of these issues are not novel or new. And we do this with all plants, right? And so I have this pulled up, and I'm actually just, I hate to do this, but I think it's really important. I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this? No, I don't know. But what it is the International Union for the Protection of New Varietals of Plants. This group is based in Geneva. They govern plants. And what this particular document is for hemp. And it gives all of the guidelines that you need to do to register a new variety of hemp. Right? So the only reason it's just hemp is because of prohibition and all the silliness that we all know way too much about. But like, we don't need to reinvent this wheel. We already have this tool. And so this is where, so I've been working with a lot of different medicinal plants, mostly southeastern endemic native species to the southeastern United States that are poached and exploited and sold overseas and, you know, ripped out of their natural environment, and the woods are destroyed for their collection. And I'm talking ginseng, golden seal, blue cohosh, black cohosh, wild yam. There's a whole list of these plants. So we do this to a lot of other plants as well, like basically abuse them. And we have all of these rules that we're just like not taking into stock or taking account of right now, and these like ways of dealing with them that we could really leverage to our benefit in the cannabis community. And I think one of the most important things when we talk about varieties, so that's why we started Candor, because coming to the party as a population geneticist and a botanist, you need a resource of an herbarium to do good science. You can't do good science. You can't do good botany without that resource. And so when we realized that resource didn't exist, we realized we had to help the community. And I've been a member of this community for a very long time as well. And it's one of the many medicinal plants that I hold very, very close to my heart. And we really need this resource. And what this resource is a way to document the work that has been done that is very simple. It's not genetics. It's not chemistry. It's pressing plants. So if you go into the wild and you find a new species of plant, the first thing you do is make an herbarium pressing. So take that plant and press it and make a documentation of that plant, and then write a species description. The same is true if you if you breed a new variety of apple or grape or cannabis, right? You should be able to write a description of why it is, and I quote from this document, distinct, in uniform, and stable, right? So every cross is not going to qualify to be a different varietal. That's not the way plants work, right? We have land races, and we have this in rice. So my dissertation was in rice. We have land races of rice. We have breeds and cultivars of rice, and then we have elite breeds, which are very, very, very similar, almost clonal, right? And so we have this whole range of type, and you have to fit into one category or another, and there's pretty straightforward guidelines to figure that out. And the community itself should be the ones that make that definition, no one from outside. And so that's really important. So everyone who's been in this for decades, you know, I have family members that, you know, are second generation, now third generation with the coming on of the, you know, young ones that are turning 21, 22, 23 in my own family that have known these plants for a long time. Those are the individuals that should be writing those definitions and making cultivar and varietal standards. And so, and that's really important because what Trevor's talking about with appellations, which is a beautiful way of protecting not only our culture, but all the other IP that surrounds the work we do, that's in addition to the plants themselves, you fundamentally need to understand the cultivars to be able to move that work forward. And so it's like, you can't almost get there without setting that groundwork, which is why, and it seems like this huge task, like how do you do it? But you do it one step at a time. You know, same when you look at roses, there's a million rose cultivars, right? And you just define them. And everyone who knows those plants knows them so well. When you talk about their core set of plants, they have a very easy time telling you why they're unique, distinct, and how they're stable, right? And so some types are going to be clonal. That's very easy to be stable. It's the same thing, propagated. Some types are going to be seed varieties, and you have to describe what are the range of traits that are acceptable for that cultivar. We just need to do this work, and this work should not come from outside. Genetics can't define cultivar. I'm a geneticist. I love genetics. Genetics cannot define cultivar. You have certain cultivars that have different genetics and are the same cultivar, and other cultivars where you have the exact same genetic where they're different cultivars. That seems very confusing, but the point is you can't use genetics to drive that decision. And so it really has to come from the community and plant descriptions themselves. That's my first like long-winded tirade.
Love it.
We had
I
go ahead.
all that. Yeah.
I was just gonna say we had something from chat. Someone said we had a couple people saying, well, they don't agree with patenting cannabis strains or copywriting cannabis strains or cultivars. Why don't you guys explain to them why that would be beneficial to someone that believes in they do and wanting things to be open source and wanting things to be available to everyone? Why it might benefit them to do that? How patenting it to release in a different kind of way rather than a selfish way can actually be a way to protect it to prevent other companies from doing that.
I'll take a stab at that. Since patents are what I do, one of the sayings I repeat a lot is, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so I will admit, as a patent attorney, I see patents and patentable subject matter all around me, and I also see them as perhaps a more attractive solution than some people do. And I acknowledge that there are some real reservations people have about claiming rights or claiming ownership over a living organism. I actually wrote a blog about this yesterday. I'm not going to just repeat the blog, but it's lessons from Tom Terrific on building fences. And if you want to go to plantlaw.com and read that, it explains the fact that I'll do a 1-minute version. You might own some land, but you might also respect the land so much that you know it was there long before you were, it'll be there long after you're gone. So you might feel like, okay, I'm a steward, but I don't really own the land. Fine. If someone tried to build a road through your land, you would do something about it. Now, if people were just kind of passing through your property and they were all peaceful and nice and cooperative, you might welcome them on. But if you don't have any enforceable property rights, if you don't have at least the freedom to build a fence, then you don't have any power to decide who does what on your land. You can't, if you don't have any rights that you're willing to claim or assert or establish, and someone wants to build a road through your land, good luck stopping them. Of course, we have property rights, and that's what makes it your land. Especially with plants, you know, I might work years coming up with a cultivar that is distinct and uniform and stable and has commercial value, and someone that I thought I trusted might get hold of a little cut from that plant and go propagate it without permission and completely erode all of the value of what I created. And if I don't have any intellectual property rights over that, all I can do, maybe I can go after them for theft, but maybe it was a cut from from something that I'd thrown away, or something that they got from someone else. And so my belief in establishing intellectual property right is it just gives you choices. It doesn't make you a heavy-handed enforcer of those rights, but it gives you the freedom to do something. It gives you the recourse if someone does come in and take what you've worked to create and illicitly, without your permission and without any kind of ethics, takes it and turns it into their own business. That should be wrong. It should be stoppable. I wish that it were stoppable without filing for a patent, but frankly, it's not. So, Trevor, I bet you got something to say.
So I'm a little bit ambivalent about the whole patent thing, just because like shit's happening. Like, it's gonna happen. We have no control over the fact that it's gonna happen. It's already happened. It's happened 8 times last week or a couple weeks ago. Biotech got more. They've had their utility patent that was out for a long time. So I feel like they're going to happen, and it's possible that it could provide some protections to people. I think that it's highly unlikely that traditional cannabis farmers and breeders are going to experience much protections through the patent system. I think that we need to develop much more particularized and specific, and also, I mean, when we talked at Meadowlands and the idea of going through patent litigation and the fact that it's going to cost 6 to 7 figures to go all the way through with it, understanding that not all cases go all the way through to full term litigation, but that's something that for most traditional cannabis farmers who have been breeding and operating in this space, the idea of $1 million litigation is something that most of us aren't prepared for. And the Monsantos, the big capitalized agricultural businesses that operate with an IP strategy that is completely predicated on consolidating IP, are prepared and capitalized specifically for that fight. And their business model is predicated on that fight. We've seen the model and what it's done historically in terms of, the 1985 case law, when it was affirmed, like, yeah, you can have patents on life, and then from there to now, like, it's been pretty intense in terms of IP consolidation under, now 4 companies. I think that we have to be strategic, and we have to take a everything approach. So sometimes patents, some people, some instances, it's going to be your best thing. And even though we as a community may have some ethical and moral qualms with the idea of people patenting the plant, it's going to happen. And sometimes for some people's businesses, that's going to be the thing that makes it so they're viable. And maybe that'll work out for the small guy in certain instances, or the small farmer in certain instances. I'm skeptical. I think that, though, community-based approaches will be really helpful. That's why I think
I will just
no, I'm talking too much. Appellations are legal.
Sorry, I'm messing with
and I think that's an IP strategy.
Well, one thing that may give you a little bit of relief to know, especially for the small farmer, if you've been working a particular plant for a while and it's in the market, so any plant that's been in the market for more than a year, you can't patent. It's no longer novel. And so if you actually have records and historical records of community resources that the community has been using, you can't patent those plants. The community owns them. And so having documentation, like this fear of having documentation, is very healthy, but also understanding that on a lot of levels, having documentation about those plants prevents individuals or companies from being able to do utility patents, because you have documentation that those utility patents aren't novel, that you have more than one kind of plant that can produce those chemistries. And also, if those plants have been in the market, they're not novel. You can't patent them. And so there's also that upside to being very pro documentation at the community level.
Here, here.
Yeah, am I unmuted? Can you all hear me? Oh, okay. It is important, really important to know that if you have, like if someone tries to claim a chemotype and they think that they can claim a utility patent on just some chemical properties, whichever plants it occurs in, then it's exactly the case that if there's anything out there that predates that filing date that comes within their claims, then their claims will be invalid. And so that can, I think the community can take a lot of comfort in that. And there is a different blog I wrote last week on patenting a chemotype that tells you how damn hard it would be, probably impossible, unless you really did come up with something absolutely new. And we can all question how likely is it that someone would create something that's really that new and be able to do it across a whole bunch of different genetics so that it would qualify for a general patent. So I think that's a really important thing to know. Just a couple things I would say about plant patenting. This I had to actually confirm with the patent office because it seemed like an interesting legal question. Before I gave a talk at MJ BizCon a couple years ago, I was wondering about, okay, what if someone has only ever sold flower? If someone's only ever sold harvested material from a cultivar, but they've never sold any plants, would that qualify for a plant patent? And here's why I was wondering about that, because a plant patent, what it claims is the actual genetics, the actual clone of that plant. And well, it claims that plant and its clones, that genotype. Now, I need to distinguish between a plant patent and a utility patent. They're not the same thing. A utility patent can cover whatever you can successfully claim. A plant patent can never cover more than one genotype and all of the clones of that genotype.
I have a question on that note. I'm going to interrupt you, but does that patent, again, I feel like this is relevant to the next part of what you're about to say, is that patent applicable to all genomic expressions of that genome? For instance, I know for a fact that I can get radically different chemotypes depending on grow method, which is kind of getting back to what you were talking about you have to do, basically, every aspect of that is a variable in this plant's environment has to be accounted for with the genomics in order to consistently reproduce that chemobar, which makes it really hard to patent. But does that single patent apply to all genetic expression of that genome type?
If it's the same genotype, if it's and we know that you can't copy a genotype, right? It's either a clone of that parent plant or some clonal progeny, or it's not. But whatever its morphology is, whatever its physiology is, whatever its chemical profile is, if it is a clone and it is a DNA match, then that will be an infringement of that patent. And if it's not, and this is just plant patents, not utility patents. But they are designed especially to protect and exclusively to protect clonally propagated plants. And it's very much like a copyright on a plant variety. So what I was getting at is that I was curious whether selling, let's say I've been selling flower for 30 years, but I've never ever sold a clone. My question to the patent office was, I could argue that clone itself hasn't been available to the public and therefore hasn't lost its novelty. That the clone, that the plant patent per se, that genetics would still be patentable. And I talked to the supervising patent examiner of the art unit that grants plant patents, and he said, you're exactly right. He said, if you haven't sold clones, you haven't lost the patentability of that variety. You certainly, if you've been selling harvested material, you certainly couldn't claim the harvested material in a utility patent. Now I'm citing my authority because it seems absolutely crazy. It seems impossible, but if you look at the way the statute is written, it requires it protects that genetic, that plants, actual plants, whole plants of that genotype. And if those whole plants themselves have never been available to the public, the fact that you've been commercializing the harvested material doesn't affect its patentability.
Okay,
So
but
that's,
I have a technical question about that, if that's cool.
yes. Sure.
Okay, and this is specifically with regards to cannabis. So I understand the technical nature of I've kept this hidden for so long, and because I've kept it hidden, it is technically patentable subject matter. But within the realm of cannabis, like if you've kept your stuff hidden for so long, like if you develop something, like let's say you develop something that like 20 years ago and you've kept it hidden for a long time, like it would have to contain something that is still so unique 20 years later that it would be worth keeping that thing a secret. Is that not correct, right? Because like assuming that people are continually moving forward and continuing to develop things like CBG and THCVA and all that kind of stuff, like that stuff that's happening now. So your, low cannabinoid profile with some moderate terpene thing from 20 years ago might be patentable subject matter, but because it doesn't express anything that would be considered patentable subject matter within the grand scope of what's available, then that's just like a reality check for that question, I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
Here's the crazy.
I was gonna say that's a great.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's a great point because I feel like every few months they have new points on new terpenes and new cannabinoids that the testing companies can test for, and that creates the ability for new patents. But what if you had a strain that was previously, there that fell into that range, chemobar utility patent or whatever XYZ.
And if you're patenting characteristics, if you're attempting to patent characteristics, or if you're attempting to patent something like harvested material or seeds or basically anything except clones, then you're talking about utility patents, and then the prior art matters. And then what I mean by that is it would be highly relevant if something within the scope of what you're claiming already existed. Then that would kill the claim. It would make the claim unpatentable. And if the patent office made a mistake and granted that claim, which has happened quite a lot, it would make the claim invalid. The problem is you'd have to go to court to prove that. But coming back to plant patents, which are very different, they are like a copyright on just that one genetic expression. And it's I wouldn't call it a genetic expression, it's a genetic combination. And what's interesting about that is that will always be unique. You don't have to, just understanding how a sexual cross occurs to create a new genotype, it's understood, and the patent office doesn't contest, that if you did that cross and you made that new individual, that's a unique cross. It's just as unique as you are from your brothers and sisters. You could make that, you could cross those parents a bazillion times, and statistically you would never get the same individual genotype. And it's that genotype that is protected by a plant patent. So it's a very unusual kind of patent, but if you've got something special that is worth commercializing, that's the real question. It's never a question, is it new enough? Is it different enough to patent? The question is it worth patenting for commercial reasons? Is it worth spending the money on it? If you're still going to be selling it in 10 years, then the answer is probably yes.
We have a question.
But
we have a question from chat on that note. Is mutated leaves constitute distinct, like duck's foot or Australian bastard cannabis? Or I don't know if you guys have seen actually Dragonfly has one. Shout out to Dragonfly Earth Medicine. Fuck yeah. They have a lace leaf of one of their gnome cultivars. I don't remember which one, but something gnome. Anyways, they have a lace leaf cultivar as well. Would that type of thing constitute as distinct enough for a separate type of patent? Even if the genetics were...
That's a great question. Yeah, even if the genetic is started from the same genetics. And there are 3 ways to qualify as an inventor of a plant variety. One is you did a cross. One is you performed mutagenesis, which of course is going to result in a new genotype, even if it's only very moderately new genotype. So it's either a cross or a caused mutation or it's what is called a sport. And botanists know a sport is a spontaneous mutation that occurs on the plant. And an example of this, I have a client that I patent their grapes, and they had a very, very successful white grape variety. And someone was walking through the fields and saw one plant that had purple grapes on it. So it was and this is planted among zillions of plants that were all identical genetically. They were all clones of each other. And so here's one that has turned purple. And that's called a sport. It's a spontaneous mutant. And they absolutely took some cuttings of that and separately patented that as a new genotype.
Yeah, but this is the same thing that happens in the flower industry all the time, in the horticultural industry, you are the one who should really speak to the difference between a plant patent and a varietal protection, because those two things are different. But if you have a yellow rose that has certain characteristics, and then same thing, you have a sport where you have a sector of that plant which then produces a white rose, you can cut that sector off and clone it and have an entirely new varietal, even though it's the same genotype, it's from the same plant.
Yes.
Right? So the genome is the same, but there's a mutation that happens that is then different. And this happens in flowers all the time and in horticultural species all the time, where then you can get a varietal protection on that different type.
That's because it's not the same genome anymore. It might be the same genome except for that one locus, but whatever is causing that new phenotype is, if that plant is consistent and cuttings of that plant are consistent, then it's absolutely under genetic control that's causing that. So that single mutation,
what genetics are controlling that difference is my point. Like, you don't need to know the genetics behind that, and it's the same plant, and it could revert back, right? It could revert back if it's a transposon.
I want to bring up a real world example just because I'm literally dealing with this on my farm. So I wanted to bring up something I'm bringing, that currently involves this exact topic. So we have cultivars. We're going to be doing a large scale test of a bunch of different cultivars, both in soil and in aquaponics. I know for a fact that across the board, CBD expresses better in aquaponics with the aquatic microbes and the terrestrial microbes to date in all but one cultivar we've ever tested. We've also, which could just be a fluke, you never know with that. We also know THCV tends to increase in expression. So we're going to do all these different things, but what if one of them was purple in soil and not in aquaponics? Or what if one was radically different morphology in aquaponics as it was in soil, but the genetics is the same? It could be even the same clone, but because it's had so much microbial interaction that changed the expression of the genome, is that enough to constitute two separate patents, which is a question that I have, because that is very much something that I have to deal with this year on my farm.
Well, here's what's interesting about that. If you could reproducibly, let's say you start with the very same genetic.
Also, Dale is not giving you legal advice.
Profile.
Dale is not giving you legal advice right now.
Thanks, Beth. My malpractice carrier will thank you for that. But if you have the very same genotype in both plants, and what you have found is a way of manipulating that plant downstream to express different things, if that manipulation process itself is new, you may well be able to claim that as an invention and file a utility patent on that. But if the genetics hasn't changed, if it's the same, if these are all clones of the same thing, that would all be covered by the single utility patent or by the single plant patent. It's only when there's an actual genetic change. And if there is a genetic change, then that would qualify as a sport. And even though that genotype might be 99.99 something percent the same, that single mutation would qualify it as a new cultivar.
Well, that's my question: is genetic expression? Obviously. So, for example, we know for a fact that the immune system expression is greater in the aquaponics than the soil, at least in our current testing that I have to date, based on terpene metrics and a couple of others. Okay. I haven't had the pleasure of doing genomic testing. We are going to do that this year in direct comparison through a university out here. We're hoping, if not, I got a friend of mine that can test it at a different university, but that's a separate conversation. It doesn't need to happen right now. But we're going to actually do that comparison this year, side by side, because it's actually cheap enough to do now. It's under that insane price threshold. So would those differences in simple gene expression, be enough to qualify? Would that have to be a different patent, or would one patent cover both of those genome expressions, or would they need a separate, as she was saying, Eleanor, the cultivar protection?
Under U.S. plant patent law, and it is different under UPOV. Eleanor was telling us about UPOV, and that's the international system that essentially every other country that protects plant IP follows UPOV. And even the U.S. has signed on to UPOV, but our implementation of UPOV is the USDA Plant Variety Protection Act rather than the Plant Patent Act. And so the way we treat seed plants is fully according to UPOV. And they have something called essentially derived varieties, which is, I think that's kind of basically it's human caused minor variations on a registered variety. But to come back to your question, I think the test you'd want to do, I'm going to geek out now from my degrees in plant science, but the test you'd want to do, of course, those are substitutes for actual experience working with the plant, which you all have. And so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert working with this plant. But if you had, let's say you've got this, this form of the plant, this expression that is physiologically and morphologically and chemically really different from another kind of a sister of that plant that is grown under different conditions. If you could swap those, take a cutting of each, and put those cuttings into one in the same situation and one in the other situation, if they follow their environment switchable back and forth, then I think that would indicate that the genetics aspect of that is the underlying genome is the same. It's the interaction of the genome with the environment that you're seeing as a difference. So for example, if you've got the one that's growing really a certain way in hydroponics and a totally different way in soil, you take a cutting from the one that's in soil and you put that in hydroponics. If it behaves exactly like the other ones that are grown in hydroponics, that would tell you that's an environmental thing, not a genetic thing. So we're getting into the deep end of this, but and I don't want to do all the talking, but it is important. I think one of the most important messages here is to distinguish between the very narrow, very genetic-driven protection that comes from plant patents, which is about copying, and the other ways that you can claim something with utility patents. Yeah, I will concede the floor to whomever else wants to speak, take over.
Well, great explanation, first of all. Thank you. You clarify it very well for people, that don't understand the patent laws and stuff. So I just want to thank you for bringing it down to where us growers can understand it.
Looks like you had something to say there, Eleanor.
Yeah, this is a similar. So what you were asking about the difference between grown in soil and hydroponics or aquaponics is similar to a lot of the questions we have with other medicinal plants. So like German chamomile, for instance, you can source German chamomile and it's always going to be German chamomile, but it's only a pharmacopoeial grade German chamomile if that chamomile produces azulene, because azulene is the molecule in chamomile that makes you sleepy. And so it's still the same plant, but the quality metric of that plant is based on the chemistry, right? So the identity is identity. Like it is German chamomile, it is German chamomile. But there are only certain regions in the world where you grow German chamomile that it produces azulene, and it can be qualified as a pharmacopoeial grade herb. So I think that's kind of similar to what you're talking about, where the plant is the same, but how you grow it affects the chemistry and thus the medicinal quality and or the pharmacopoeial grade of that plant. So we do this with a lot of other plants too.
So then do you agree that it's the same plant or is it different?
I agree that it's the same plant, and I also kind of disagree with Dale about identity. Like things that have a point mutation, I don't think are different plants. I think that we don't sequence entire genomes. It's intractable, especially at this time. And you have to, for a plant pattern, in my understanding, describe where you're making that genetic change. And then a varietal protection is different than a plant patent because you don't need to have any genetics behind a varietal protection. Like those are different classes of protection, and varietal protection can extend to things like populations of seeds that don't have to be 100% for breeding. They have to be within a certain range, defined range. So please explain me why I'm wrong, because that's my deep understanding, and I am hitting a wall maybe there. So.
Okay, when I was working with this grape that switched from green to purple and created a whole new market basically for this grape, the grape geneticists that we talked to, and we talked to several, they all agreed that that would be a mutation somewhere in the anthocyanin biosynthetic pathway. That there would have to be a mutation that would basically, white grapes are white because they don't make anthocyanin, and purple grapes are purple because they make plenty of it. So whatever gene had been turned off in the anthocyanin biosynthetic pathway in the white grapes got turned back on with a mutation. And as long as what happened, I know this from from having watched this happen, they ended up cloning that single mutation into tens of, I think thousands of acres all around the world. It's a separate cultivar. It has a separate patent. And the interesting thing is nobody ever asked for a DNA sequence. Nobody ever asked for us to pinpoint where that mutation was. The phenotype itself made it very clear, the phenotype and the stability. And that's where you go back to the DUS tests that UPOB talks about. Distinctness, uniformity, and stability. The genetic stability of that, cloning who knows how many, hundreds of thousands of plants, always getting the purple, would indicate that that's a genetically stable variant. And even though it's a tiny variant, one thing that's important to understand, and I wrote a blog about this too, is you don't need any DNA information at all to get a plant patent. If you have it, you're probably going to need it when it's time to prove that someone's infringing, because you're going to need to prove that it's the very same. But to get the plant patent, you don't have to have any DNA at all. I've filed hundreds of plant patents and never ever submitted DNA material or DNA sequence, anything like that. So it's a crazy system. I'm not going to defend that the system makes a lot of sense. Part of it is just that it's been around since the 30s, and they established those rules way before DNA sequencing was an option.
But I think there's another example that is on the other side of it that we should consider. So if you look at redbud, Cirrus alba, you have populations of redbud, which is the kind of tree that makes these beautiful red buds. And you have a varietal alba. And it doesn't matter, you can have, so you have, let's say, genotype A, B, C, and D in a population that are all distinct. They're not the same genome, they're all redbud. But any one of those has a point mutation, again, in the color pigmentation pathway that makes that bud white. That is redbud varietal alba, and that varietal is protected. And the genomes are not the same. I mean, it's a concrete.
That could be under UPOB. Yeah, that could be under UPOB.
I mean, this is a native plant here, and it's one of the few examples of a natural occurring varietal. So there's disparate genomes that have the same phenotype and thus the same, so they're varietal alba, which is protected in commerce, even though the genomes are not the same. There's a lot of variation at every other point in the whole genome. So I'm just saying it's way more complicated, and genetic identity doesn't drive that. Coming from another geneticist.
I'll just say this, and then I'll say this, and then we can move on to, I'm sure people have other topics they want to talk about, but one of the things that you have that disqualifies you from getting any plant patenting is if the variety was found in nature, or if the mutation was found in an uncultivated state, that's considered a product of nature and therefore not patentable. That doesn't mean it's not a new variety. It just means it's not one that any human being had enough interaction with to make it patentable subject matter. There's no inventor. So as a product of nature, it doesn't qualify for patent.
Yeah, but that's where I want you to draw the distinction between a plant patent and varietal protection, because those are two very distinct things and are important. So it might not qualify for a plant patent, but it does qualify for varietal protection.
Well, a natural product, a product of nature won't qualify under UPOB either. And UPOB is what the Plant Variety Protection Act is. So it could be defined as a variety, that's different. But giving a person, an inventor, a breeder, intellectual property rights over that variety wouldn't be available because it's a product of nature. There would be no inventor. So I think we might be mixing up the definition of distinct varieties versus the availability of intellectual property to protect those varieties. It could absolutely be a distinct variety, but it might not be protectable because it's a product of nature. Anyway.
Well, I know that there's only one group that can sell this in commerce. So.
Then it just wouldn't be a product of nature. I could challenge that patent all day long if it's really a product of nature and nobody bred it, nobody discovered it in a cultivated state. Then
okay, so you could take more than one individual and make the same mutation over and over with different genetic backgrounds to have the same phenotypic effect. Same thing. So a human could have done the mutation.
So I feel like this also gets more complicated when you also layer on top of everything that we just discussed on morphology, the chemovars, and that's why it gets really ridiculous when people try to go and patent some of these chemovar expressions and stuff. I mean, you guys just talked all about, and you guys are just talking about whether or not something is purple. We weren't even talking about THC levels and CBD levels.
Right.
You know, we're talking about something that's like extremely basic, and listen to how much that is something that can be debated. So as you know, as soon as you get into the chemovars, now we're down a whole separate set of rabbit holes that are all kinds of layers on top of that, and that's why it makes kind of no sense. Beth, do you want to mention that one particular one you mentioned earlier, or do you not want to mention that on air?
Which
That's
one?
fine. The CBD one.
Oh no. So as of a couple of days ago, CBG, there was some new patent applications. Actually, Dale, will you talk about these patent applications that have recently been released with regards to the production of CBG? I feel like you will be able to do that the best justice, but with your understanding of the landscape and all.
Biotech International LLC just had published a whole bunch of patent applications. In the U.S., they had filed some plant patent applications, which are directed to just one claim and clones of one cultivar. And I was looking at that and thinking, oh, they finally learned their lesson. But then Beth and some other people on my email commiseration society pointed out that no, they have also claimed chemotypes in these recently published international applications. And they published, I believe there were 3 that were published about June 13th or something like that. And they actually do claim chemotypes. And so they are back at it, but I will just I'll stand on what I put in my blog about the difficulty of near impossibility of a legitimate patent on a chemotype. To give the 30-second version of it, to have a legitimate patent on a chemotype, that particular chemical profile can never have existed in any prior cultivar, natural or human bred. And so you have to have a genuinely new chemotype. It has to be new enough that it's not some trivial variation on some pre-existing one, because that would be considered obvious by the patent examiner. So you have to clear the hurdle of novelty, which means it can't ever have existed before in any genetic background. Then you have, unless they specify the genetic background in their claim, which they do specify it, like one locus of it has to have certain, but it's not very genotype specific. So, but then you've got to have, it can't be a trivial variation on the chemotype. But in addition to that, you have to describe it. There's this requirement in the U.S. patent law that you're not entitled to a utility patent unless you can describe your invention so well that a person of ordinary skill in the art can make and use the invention without undue experimentation. And so what that means is if I claim a chemotype, and we've been talking about the fact that you can get so much chemotypic variation, so much phenotypic variation by the way you cultivate the plant. And so if I try to patent a chemotype and I don't have a hell of a thorough guidebook on how to cultivate that plant to get the chemotype I'm after and not to get any of these other things, then I'm never going to meet the so-called written description requirement or the enablement requirement. Written description shows you is your evidence that you had possession of the invention as of the filing date in the full scope of what you're claiming. And the enablement requirement is you've got to teach someone how to make that same thing just by your written description without having any particular starting material. Well, you can tell them what starting material to start with, but you can't, unless you're limiting your claims to a genotype, then you can't require that they start with the same genotype. So bottom line is, I'm highly skeptical. I'm not expressing an opinion about those particular patents. I haven't deconstructed them. I haven't been hired to express an opinion on that stuff. But I will tell you, I'm highly skeptical that anybody is ever going to get a valid patent on a chemotype unless it is a hell of an unusual, brand new, completely different, eye-popping chemotype, and they tell everybody how to cultivate that just right so they can always get what they've claimed. That's going to be really, really damn hard.
So there is a question in chat. What is the difference between a plant patent and then a varietal protection in particular? Just, you know, nuts to bolts.
In the U.S., yeah, the U.S. is, sorry, the U.S. is the only system that has something like a plant patent. And this is a historical anomaly that back in the 30s, there was a group of probably people with trees and vines and certain kinds of asexually propagated plants that didn't feel like they were getting any kind of adequate protection. And so they agitated Congress enough that Congress passed the Plant Patent Act, but it was limited only to asexually propagated plants. It just didn't touch seeds. I think it was because the whole seed, you know, the variability in a seed batch, et cetera, it was just too complicated for them to tackle that. Or for whatever reason, maybe that group just didn't have the influence. But anyway, Congress passed in the 30s this Plant Patent Act. They've refreshed it a little bit in the 50s, but that's the thing that establishes this thing that's like a copyright on a plant variety. And the only way you can infringe it is if you get your hands on that parent plant, that genotype, and make actual clones. You can't infringe it through similarity. You can only infringe it by cloning it. Now, the rest of the world follows this system called UPOV, this Union for Protection of Varieties. It's a French acronym. And UPOV has been around since the 60s. Different countries, and they have 3 different versions of it now. They've kind of updated the model legislation. But the way UPOV works is they put this out there, and if you want to be a member in good standing of UPOV as a country, you have to pass legislation that matches one of their models. And the U.S. Passed one of the versions of UPOV into law, but instead of putting that under the auspices of the Patent Office, they put it under the auspices of the USDA. And so as to not undercut the plant patent system, they limited the scope of UPOV to only cover seed-propagated plants, basically everything that wasn't covered by the plant patent system. And so in the U.S., but it's only in the U.S., this so-called plant variety protection is limited to just seed-propagated plants. In the rest of the world, they treat seed-propagated and asexually propagated under the very same legislation. And I've taken a lot of asexually propagated plants into other countries for intellectual property protection, and you're working under the very same kind of statutory scheme that the USDA has just for seed plants. So it's crazy confusing at first. And the US is the only country like this. But the easy way to remember it is if you treat a plant as an invention and you've created something that is reproducible with a variety of genetic backgrounds and you're thinking of it as an actual invention, like a new chemotype or like something that's disease resistant across a whole bunch of genetic backgrounds, that would be an invention like a tractor or a semiconductor. And you do that like traditional utility patent. If you have one distinct genotype and you just want to protect its clones and you're only clonally propagating it, that would be something you protect with a plant patent. And if you have something that you're propagating with seeds, then you can do that through a utility patent, or you can do it under the USDA Plant Variety Protection Act. That's where people go to protect their seed cultivars. And as Eleanor was saying, they have different standards. You don't have to have genetic identity within that whole seed batch because you never would, unless you had fully homozygous parents. Those are those three systems. It's, you know, don't do this at home. Just call me and I'll help you with it.
Eleanor, did that address your point you were worried about?
Yeah, just the point is you can get protection over disparate groups like seeds. Like they don't have to be clonal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't be. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
And I think that Dale also brings up something. He brings up a couple of important things, which is, well, one, well, you mentioned this whole conversation. I think, you know, it harkens back to a lot of conversations that you and I have had together. You know, there are all of these different types of registrations, whether it's a variety protection, whether it's a plant patent, whether it's a utility patent. And I think that for most people growing, like, I can't say that like this is necessarily a good use of time and money in terms of protection. Like this is a good use of time and money if you were going into a big ag scenario and you want to be able to protect your work in that sense. Or if you're like, hey, I have something that's really unique. Like let's say I have some high CBG producing plant, for example. And maybe I want to be a great person and give that to the public domain. So maybe what I do is I get a patent in service of giving that to the public domain, which is similar to what the inventor of penicillin did. Rather than actually, you know, getting a patent for himself and charging a bunch of money for penicillin, he handed it over to the United States government, which you could trust at the time. That sounds very nice. And then, you know, the patent for that was basically given to the public so that people could have cheap access to penicillin. So, you know, unless you're doing something like that, like, it seems like it's questionable, which then also comes back to the need for documentation. I still, you know, I should say that, you know, through this process, I have just a really hard time really laying claim over any kind of ownership over a traditional plant, especially a traditional plant that doesn't have its origins here in the United States, you know, or in North America. You know, but, you know, so I very much am an advocate for the documentation piece of this, because I feel like that is such a great way to say this exists. This is the, you know, the mark in the sand. This is how, you know, I feel very good about protecting things. But the other thing that you bring up that is important for people who are interested in, you know, Trevor brought up the idea about open source licenses, which is still something that I think that we need to resolve. The US is just different in all of these really annoying and irritating ways when it comes to these things. So like, you know, this open source license that works with German law, I have yet to find a good answer to the question, how well does this, you know, and Dale, maybe you can offer it to me, like, you know, how well does this open source license work within the framework of US law? The US has not signed the convention, is not a signatory on the Convention for Biological Diversity, upon which that license and the associated framework is based. We are different in that, you know, we have plant variety protection, whereas Canada and others have plant breeders' rights, which work in a really similar way. So, you know, what sort of considerations, you know, this is a question for Dale, like what considerations do we have to make in the United States that are different from other countries in the world? And what do you think that, and actually, and then a question for Eleanor, what do you think that we can learn from other countries in terms of how they assign protections to plants and advocate for, you know, in some countries there really is an advocacy for, you know, indigenous rights to that plants and the Nagoya Protocol and all of that. So I would love to hear an explanation on the US from Dale and sort of internationally from Eleanor, please.
I'll go first so I don't forget your question. I think that, well, maybe I already did forget the question, but it elicited this desire to make a comment. Let's put it that way.
It's cool. Yeah, that's fine. And I know that was a very long-winded, slightly stoned question.
Okay. I want to just give an example. I'm going to fictionalize it just enough so that I'm respecting the client's confidentiality, but this is substantially the story. I work with a client who is an old school cannabis breeder. He's been through all the wars. He's done time. He loves the plant, and his life's work really is the work that he's done to develop a small set of plants that have unusually commercially really valuable high levels of a minor cannabinoid. This is something he's been spending every last penny on certificates of analysis and bat guano and all kinds of things. He's a lovable fanatic about the genetics of this plant. He loves it as much as anybody in any other part of the world could love cannabis. He's also absolutely scraping by. He had to borrow money to work with me on the patent, and basically there's a whole bunch of it that I'm not billing, and I think we're going to make a deal. I'm not interested in making money off him, although I have employees I have to pay and stuff like that. But really, I want to help him protect his life's work. And he's kind of maxed out on his available money. We know what legalization has done to small breeders and small growers. And so this is the way he's going to pay for his retirement, if he ever gets a retirement. This is the way he's going to, this is not something that he has the luxury really of dedicating to the public. And it's really special, and it's going to have a very high value. It's an important minor cannabinoid. So one thing I'll stress is we've never talked about protecting it as a chemotype. We're not trying to we're not going to be the ones that try to say we're the only ones with a right to any plants that ever express this particular minor cannabinoid in high amounts. But the protection for him, he needs plant patents so that if anyone gets a hold of his mother plants and clones them, we've got a relatively straightforward way to go after that. But he also needs to protect the seeds of plants like that, and he needs to protect the extracts. He needs to protect all the ways that you can derive commercial value from that plant. Again, he's not rich enough to have the luxury of just dedicating this to the public. This is how he's going to pay his bills for the rest of his life. And so the right strategy there, because the US is so damn complicated, and that's unfortunate, but the right strategy is to have plant patents to make it so that there's a very straightforward way of going after people who clone this, and that any clones of that main plant are covered by that plant patent. But because that's not enough, because a plant patent won't do anything to protect his seeds or his extracts or the sexual progeny of let's say, an F1, you can protect all those things with a utility patent. Now, it's still going to be limited to his genetics. So, the claims will be the sexual progeny of this particular cultivar that is on deposit somewhere. And so it's still a focused and relatively narrow patent. But there are situations where that really is the only way he's ever going to get people to work with him to scale this up on a commercial level. And he might be able to license this to a hemp breeder and have large amounts of hemp that will produce this minor cannabinoid. That would also be protected by his utility patent, only narrowly though, if these are actual progeny of his original plant. And so my point is that this system is complicated. It's definitely not for every situation. You can have a cultivar that you love and that you don't need to extract a lot of commercial value out of. Don't waste your money on IP. But in some cases, if you want to build a business on especially in a cutthroat competitive space, like I said, don't bring a blunt to a gunfight. You've got to be prepared to play by those rules. And I remember one thing I wanted to comment on, something Trevor said. It is absolutely daunting to think about suing someone for patent infringement. The good news is, out of the thousands of plant variety, either plant breeders' rights in some countries, plant variety protection in other countries, and that's mostly just a distinction of what they call it in those countries. It's all under UPOP, or plant patents or utility patents. Of all those that have been obtained, I think only one client has ever even had to litigate one of them, because I don't think it's because they were wasting their time getting those plant patents. I think it was because people in the industry knew that there was recourse. They weren't going to mess around with it. It's if they hadn't had that protection, then anyone could have taken a cutting and completely commercialized their same cultivars with no recourse. So, it's a suboptimal system to be sure, but that's kind of how the system works.
Before we move to Eleanor, I'd like to ask a question if I can. That came out in chat too. One of the regular listeners in chat was asking, well, so you get your your patented your material hijacked, how do you really know? How do you go? How can you even go after them? Because unless they were to call it the same thing, so to speak. So if you're hijacked, how are you going to even know? So how are these patents going to be applied, or this intellectual property applied in those situations?
Well, that's where you take your material. That's when DNA matters.
Okay.
It doesn't. You don't have to get have DNA submissions or information. But if you do a DNA match and you find that the accused plant is the same genetically across a lot of markers as the patented plant, then they've got a really hard time saying, "Well, we didn't copy this." At some point, statistically, they can't say it with any credibility. And even a few dozen highly polymorphic markers, meaning markers with a lot of variation at each point, and you keep hitting exact matches across all of those markers, statistically, you get to the point that there aren't enough molecules in the plant to even count all the unlikelihood of that being an accidental match. And so you don't ever have to do a full sequence. You just do a thorough test.
I think what he was getting at is more is how you're going to catch them in the first place. You know, that's the thing. You know, and I mean, as much as that answered the question on one side of it, he was more concerned about if you're hijacked, how you going to even know to be able to have to go after them for DNA, you know, DNA testing aside. I think that's what he was asking.
And I think the answer to that from the clients that I work with, a lot of them, if they have something that's really valuable, they do a lot of their own kind of their own market intelligence. That they keep track of, you know, if it's in the blueberry business, they know the special features that make their blueberries especially valuable in the stores, and somebody now is competing with them on that very same basis. They're going to, out of curiosity at least, get a quick DNA test and see if they match. And so if you have something about your plant that made it protectable in the first place, and you love that made it worth protecting in the first place because it occupied a really promising market niche, for example, and then somebody else comes in and squats right down in that same market niche. They've got, oh, look, we have this a very similar chemotypic, probably the same as we know, because that could be a matter of cultivation, but it has some of these great, it's productive or it's disease resistant, whatever. If it starts to look like enough of a match, that's when you get suspicious. But you really have to do your own watching of your competitors. There's no easy way around that.
Eleanor, I'd love to get to you. I know we were about to cut over.
Yes, I think what Beth is asking me to speak on is actually the Nagoya Protocol. And this is an interesting thing for all of us to consider because it makes us realize that maybe all of us should be paying someone else for the ability to use cannabis and to breed cannabis. And so what the Nagoya Protocol does is it speaks about the access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. And so this protocol is held by the Convention on Biological Diversity. Of course, like a lot of things, the United States is not a signatory. Another reason to be disappointed in the country we live in. But they have a great acronym, CBD, which is nice. But what the Nagoya Protocol is really saying is that if you use biological material from another country, like cannabis didn't arise here, right? It came from somewhere else and we brought it here, then we have a moral and ethical obligation to, as we are accessing that genetic resource that we've taken from somewhere else, to give back and share the benefits that arise from our utilization of that plant to the country of origin. And so this happens in the natural products world all the time. So if you're doing anything, ginkgo is a really good example. Ginkgo comes from China. If you're doing anything where you're leveraging the genetic resources of ginkgo, like an ID test or a special kind of chemistry, you are obligated to give back. And normally it's in a profit sharing to a nonprofit, a % of your profit back to that country as a thank you for leveraging their genetic diversity for your own gain. So it kind of puts it a little bit in perspective where maybe all of us should be thinking about the fact that we're gaining economic value and economic gain from a plant that we've moved around. I mean, what do you take when you move? your plants and your animals, right? Beyond your family, like especially your medicinal plants and your food plants, food animals. And so we have a long history as a people of transporting these plants around, but just to really acknowledge the fact that the IP that we are now fighting over in some silly way kind of doesn't even belong to us. And so really just like remembering that that's also the case. And I would suggest everyone go to the Convention on Biological Diversity and look up the Nagoya Protocol. It's a very interesting read, and I think it really puts in perspective what we should be thinking about when we're talking about fair and equitable sharing of benefits that arise out of the utilization of genetic resources that come from a specific bioregion. So just a little bit of international perspective.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting.
Perspective.
So we had a great question from chat. I don't know if people are aware of this one, but I'm going to swing and see if anyone wants to go at it. We had, where was it? Okay. Would like to hear comments on the United Cannabis Corporation versus Pure Hemp Collective, Inc. 118 CV01922, currently pending going through claims construction in Colorado. After, is a federal court going to award damages for a cannabis-related patent? Is the impact of federal scheduling matter at all to the case? Which I think is a great question. And
I'm going to jump into this. Yeah, I'm
not legal advice
Sorry.
or anything like that. Preface before you say anything else. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks again. I had to study this because I was on a panel about this just last week in San Francisco. Is it? Yeah, it was last week. It's Tuesday, right? So,
Yeah, Tuesday.
and I had a long conversation that same day with someone on Instagram about this. So I'm going to stipulate, first of all, to say that there's only one court that's dealt with this so far, and other courts could deal with it differently. But here's what we see with this court. When this case got filed, well, I'll give you a little bit of background. This is a patent that claims any liquid formulation that contains a cannabinoid if that cannabinoid is at least 95% X, Y, or Z. And depending on the claim you're reading, it's either 95% CBD, or it's 95% THC, or it's 95% of a combination of CBD and THC, or it's 95% of, I don't know, there's some other cannabinoids, maybe CBG, but there's a bunch of different claims, and each one asserts that these guys invented liquid formulations as of, I think the patent goes back to 2015. Maybe it goes back to 2014. It doesn't go back that far. So their theory of patentability, the patent office, is that they were the first people to ever make.
Wasn't that guy, his name was Dr. Wallace, or we've talked about him on the show, that did work back in World War II, isolated both THC and CBD isolated in both solid and liquid forms in alcohol solutions, which would negate any of their claims.
And exactly. And so I read, because I had to be on this panel and I didn't want to not know what I was talking about, I read through a mountain of court papers. I certainly didn't memorize them all, and I deserve the right to be wrong in the details. But basically, these guys claimed that they got this through the patent office, and we can talk sometime about how things get through the patent office. It's a problem of the fact that this industry doesn't have a big library of literature, of prior academic literature. There's a whole lot of prior commercial activity, but that was all opposite of being published. It was kind of held in secret. But nonetheless, this patent got granted, and I think United Cannabis had a strategy of, well, let's sue somebody, let's put some points on the board, everybody else will take a license because they don't want to be sued. But if you look at Pure Hemp Collective's response to the complaint, they listed all kinds of liquid formulations that are high in this cannabinoid that are above allegedly pure, so 99 point something percent of one cannabinoid or another. that predated the patent. And so they in their answer, they had a strong rebuttal to the validity of that patent. Now, one of the things that a lot of people were wondering, when I saw this lawsuit, I was thinking, okay, this is the big test. It could be that the federal judge could say, this is illegal subject matter. I'm not even gonna hear this case. I'm not gonna help this bad guy enforce his or her rights against this other bad guy. The federal judge in this case did not do that. This case was begun, I believe, last August. It's now July. Maybe it was last July, but it's been nearly a year that this case has been going on. The federal judge hasn't thrown it out yet. So that question of whether you can litigate cannabis patents in federal court, notwithstanding the scheduling of THC, and remember, some of these claims are very much about a pure formulation of THC. That would be federally illegal, right? But it's still, the Patent Office doesn't concern itself with legality. They leave that to other agencies. And to the surprise of many, the judge hasn't refused to hear this case. The judge is basically, I think, taking the position, hey, it's a federal right that was duly issued by a federal agency. I'm going to stay in my lane and just look at the legality, not the legality of the product, but the legal issues of patent infringement. And so far, Pure Hemp Collective tried to get the case thrown out on the basis that this was a product of nature. And the judge refused that theory because the judge said, basically, all right, it may be that what's in there is a product of nature, but nature has never produced a liquid formulation that's this pure. There was a lot of argument about what about when you just, squeeze out all the good stuff out of the trichomes. But the judge bought the plaintiff's argument that is basically a runny solid instead of a liquid formulation, that it's not a real liquid. And so where we are now is that the case is still pre-trial. They haven't gotten to the point of being able to really argue about the novelty, and for the defendant to present all of their evidence about why this just isn't new. But I think, and for me to actually express a legal opinion, I'd have to have all kinds of caveats, and I'd have to study this even more than I have. But I will just say that a lot of people I talk to, lawyers and other people in the industry, have serious doubts that the United Cannabis patent is valid. And if you have personal knowledge of a liquid formulation that has cannabinoids in it, it doesn't even have to be a pure formulation. It just has to be that 95% of the cannabinoids that are in there would be one or the other, or something that's claimed. So it's not claiming that 95% of everything in that liquid formulation is a cannabinoid even. It's just whatever cannabinoids are there, 95 this versus 5 or less of the other. So bottom line is, if you already know of something like that predated that patent, then you personally have your own strong conviction that that patent isn't valid, at least that particular claim. But yeah, to answer the question.
My question is with dabs and there's documentation for like someone brought up CBD to THC. I know that I personally own a book that was published in 1970 that lists the chemical formulation on how to convert CBD to THC. Yet I've heard of multiple companies claiming that patent, which is complete BS. There's a bunch of stuff like this that's totally off the wall, that not only is this well documented, this is in publicly available, openly published books that are also available in ebook that you could buy on Amazon. This isn't, how is it that they're able to even attempt these patents? I know since 1996, you've been able to go to a store that in California that you could buy these cultivars that had those particular things. Is that not count for these utility patents? That's a huge question that I have, especially with dabs. I know I've been able to buy pure THC since at least 2012 in Colorado. How is it that they can patent when that's been available in the market since then?
Is it arguable whether a dab is a liquid, or could it be, one of these runny solids? Or,
in your standard 1 gram dab cartridge. You're buying a pen.
It's like an oil, right? It's an oily. It's a really fluid consistency and not.
Yep.
Resin.
Absolutely. Yeah, because they cut them with either
See, I'm
propanol or with terpenes, depending on the group, how shady the person is that makes them.
See, I'm sitting here proving that I'm a botanist and a patent guy, but I'm not an industry veteran, and I don't pretend to be. I'm learning the industry as I go. But to answer the question, the patent examiners, they typically search academic literature and prior patent literature, but they, I don't think their process is as thoroughly worked out as it is in other industries that have a much more rich literature. Sometimes too, you can claim something in such a way to specifically get around. If you know of let's say you know of something that's in a book, you can add some things to that claim so that that book, whatever that book discloses, your claim is just different enough that it would survive scrutiny as to that thing. But these claims are so damn broad, it's hard to imagine how they're going to survive, since there does appear to be a lot of evidence of prior liquid formulations. That is me taking what people told me about liquid formulations and applying it to what I know about patent law. I'm still not opining on that patent specifically. But what we do know is this particular federal court is still hearing the case. And I do. One other thing I want to say. One of my other goals for this year, apart from the first two that I described, is I blogged about this, but I want it to be way more than a blog. I want to help encourage all the small cannabis people and businesses to form some kind of a pool, a mutual defense pool of all of their patents and a little bit of a donation to whatever group would manage this, that it's kind of a mutual defense concept. And anybody who does get sued for some crazy ass patent like this, everybody steps up and helps them out. That's a blog I wrote called Standing Up to Big Ag. It's also on plant law, and it proposes that we organize ourselves in that way. Briefly, in the electronics industry, the big companies don't sue each other because they both have they do sometimes, but it's really rare. They both have so many patents that they know they could just sue each other to death. And so what they do instead is they cross-license each other, or they just leave each other alone.
That happens in the ag space.
Small cannabis. Yeah, it's pretty common. It's a lot more rational than dragging your enemy into court for mutually assured destruction. But in small,
no,
go ahead.
Finish. You were finishing a thought. I apologize.
But the idea is that all these small cannabis companies, a lot of them won't even have patents. Others might have some of them somewhere. If we have a big enough patent pool, they might have some patent that this big patent abuser would be infringing. And so if we can say, well, okay, you think that we're infringing your patent, well, we think you're infringing our patent. So do you want to just settle this, or do you really want to go through court? Plus, by the way, you're not suing one little company, you're suing this whole mutual defense fund, and we're ready to go toe-to-toe with you if we have to. But we think that you've got a lousy prior art situation, and we have everybody who's going to help us dig into what's happening in the industry and not just in academic papers. We've got resources, and I'm really hoping that we can organize in a way that takes that from a concept into an actual meaningful organization that can protect people from abusive litigation.
You need to establish your own independent multimedia type service instead of using Facebook for people, or Instagram. You need to start some kind of deal like that so people can just join it and then discuss everything intellectually amongst that.
So we haven't heard much from SunGrownMidz yet. Let's we'll give you the floor. I apologize.
No worries. There's a lot of area experts on the line, and I'm more of an internet troll, so I definitely like to hear from experts. Yeah, I think we're in, obviously we all know we're in the Wild West. There's an incongruent system. Everything Dale's talking about and Eleanor's talked about in terms of there being a complex system, just in terms of how these there's an incongruent complex system for how the plant IP protection system operates. While it's very complicated, I think there's also some things that we just need to like recognize. Eleanor mentioned this earlier, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The stuff, while it's complex and it's hard to like get your head around, we kind of know exactly how these things have operated historically. We can see, like, right now we're kind of in the IT world of the 80s and the 90s in terms of everybody just trying to grab as many patents as they can possibly grab, because it's a patent grab sort of boom. And if you can get IP now, you can do things like what Dale's describing in terms of getting patent protection for things that already exist, just because the patent office hasn't caught up with the state of the art in the black market and illicit market that this has traditionally operated under, and is now coming into a regulatory framework. So, you know, we're in this Wild West, but we also know what happened very quickly in the IT world when IP strategies that were taken by the same 5 or 6 IT tech companies and the same ag companies that dominate ag. They have a particular tech strategy and they are going to deploy it. One thing that I want to, like, biotech industries has been the boogeyman. It seems like they're taking this sort of smash and grab approach of let's just grab as many patents as we can possibly grab, as quickly as we can possibly grab them, as broadly as we can possibly grab them, and go hard. Clearly, Philo's had an IP strategy that they were pursuing that is predicated around the things that Mowgli said at that AEIC meeting or whatever it is, the biotech people, where he's like, hey, we're going to create this 4%, you know, high terpene, high caryophyllene, automated low water booth for distillate and, you know, carts, basically, manufactured products. And then he clearly has a strategy for pursuing more of a value added, high quality breeder sort of market. So those IP strategies are very specific IP strategies that they're going to pursue. They're going to pursue economies of scale. They're going to seek to push out small actors. They're going to seek to try and do what they've already done in terms of co-opting as much of our IP as they possibly can, and then pursuing their proprietary IP strategy. We need to not get like bogged down in the complexity of all of this and really remember there's a few core ideas, principles, and strategies. A lot of this has already been developed in other places. And we really do need to think of it as a international sort of response to the consolidation of our intellectual property. And I think of this as like, we can't think of this as a zero-sum situation amongst people who have essentially been exchanging a plant and utilizing a plant for all of history. Every culture that has ever come in contact with this plant has figured out their own vibes and their own thing with the plant and have had different dynamics that have produced different outcomes in their particular places with the plant. And so we can't be like, hey, like, we're gonna like wall off our space of this thing and be like, no, fuck you guys. We need to recognize that like cat's out of the bag, and how do we, instead of like creating like zero-sum strategies, fucking getting involved in a rat race that honestly isn't going to work for a lot of people. Like, to be honest, like, it's the whole commercial thing that's going on in California is completely fucked, and we need to go after the entire supply chain. We need to have, you know, we need to coalesce and have buyer co-ops, and we need to create the demand for the type of products that we want, because the type of products that are on the shelf is fucking terrible right now because there's a supply chain bottleneck and not enough dispensaries. So it's kind of like, the way I see it, it's all across the board, we need to be figuring out strategies for building up community resilience and not figuring out ways of like getting confused, getting bogged down, or breaking down into just enclaves of what is going to end up being like, you know, probably a very bad path. And I think that instead of just walling ourselves off, we need to come up with strategies that build a networked approach. And one of the things that I think needs to come into the discussion and how we operate is the development of really coordinating across the state, across international boundaries, figuring out these regulations and developing people who are growing and producing and engaging with cannabis outside of the commercial space, as well as those who are operating within the cannabis space. Because people growing their 6 plants and pursuing their passion and getting laws changed locally, because we've got this fucked up local control thing in California, so that people can actually grow their 6 plants outdoors, is going to be incredibly important. And we need, like, it's people who are pursuing their passion and who really care about this plant, who aren't going to be making decisions based on margins and market demand, shelf space, and all these other dynamics that produce outcomes that we've seen in other bulk commodities. We also need to, within the commercial space, create those alternatives to protect those high-end niche market differentiators and actually encourage and develop these institutions in ways that that support local, like support what we've been doing historically. That's really kind of what I'm about. I understand, there's lots of different issues with what we've done historically. Like, there are environmental concerns that we definitely have to address when we set up agriculture in places that are not traditional agricultural lands. And that's something about coming in online in California, where we need to now take into account that we're in these watersheds and engage in sustainable agricultural practices and really be much more conscious than people were historically, when we were literally just setting up because we were operating under prohibition models. Now, that said, in this new commercial model, we need to link up, and we need across the state, through the Appalachia system or through other network dynamics of people, breeders if you're a nursery and you operate in a particular county or area, you need to link up with licensed producers in your area, and you need to actually start developing a participatory breeding program in your area, because the nurseries are the ones that produce the clones and produce the seeds and can sell these commercially in the state regulatory system. The farmers who are licensed are going to be going through plants on a scale that's just unmatched with anything we've done prior, and linking those two groups up and those two license types up in a way that makes it so the historic knowledge of breeders who have been breeding in particular areas and regions is brought to bear with the farmers and the cultivators in a way that maximizes our, like, everybody sort of rises together when we work together, is what I think needs to be the framework. So we need to, none of this is that complicated. It's really simple. We got to work together and build networks of solidarity. And just remember this shit, fucking people did this shit in fucking other crops that got fucking no fucking money. There's an organic fucking corn movement and shit. People figure that shit out, and corn doesn't make a lot of money, but there's heirloom corn.
I'll tell you what, I wanted to throw in this, kind of you hit it a little bit, but I look at it like this is, you saw all right, it was the Wild West comment. Okay, the Wild West comment. Well, and that's exactly what it is. The government's not prepared for this in the first place. just that, and that's the reason that the patent offices aren't prepared. Nobody's really prepared. I mean, there's a lot, like you said, there's a patent grab going on, so to speak, like a gold rush or something like that. But I think that's the whole thing that we find every time something like this happens. We saw it on the state level, but now, all right, I want to just say, I meant to start out going, we won. We won. It's coming. It's now we got to deal with that. And so it's no different than those same times in history when there was such a big, just, significant change in laws and the way something was treated, especially a medicinal plant like cannabis. But that's about all I wanted to say. And I pass it back to everybody. But I thought y'all hit the head, but it's all about the government they're not prepared for this either. They don't have a plan because they've never studied it.
I wanted to also say Kevin McKernan, we invited him. He wasn't able to make it. I was hoping to have his input as well. Maybe he can make it next week. But he actually has some really cool technology. I think it's a little $800 PMC or PLC or whatever it is that you can plug into your computer that can do in-house sex testing. And it also is going to be able to be programmable for a bunch of other things too later on. So I think that's kind of the future of some of the stuff that people were relying on things from companies like Phylos and some of these other genetics companies where they were risking having their stuff being sequenced or potentially stolen or patented. You'll be able to, do this stuff in-house in your own grow and not have to worry about sending your material out, not have to worry about exposing a PCR. Thank you. Doing this stuff in-house in your own lab, for less than $1,000 and being able to do a large, a variety of different things as the technology evolves. The price is going to come down. What this thing's going to be capable of doing is going to increase. And you're going to see similar products as well that are going to compete in that market as that market grows. And that's really going to compete directly with these large corporations and allow you to do your in-house data sets that are going to allow you to not have to worry about relying on these outside companies. There's just a point I want to bring up, and then I know Beth has some cool things she wants to tell us about as well.
Cool, thanks. And actually, yeah, I have a lot to say because there have been so many wonderful things shared on this podcast tonight. I've taken lots of notes, and I feel like everybody has shared something that I relate to and want to respond to. So first, I want to thank Dale and Eleanor for your responses. And one thing that I took from both of your responses, which I thought was really interesting. Dale, you responded to, I expressed this idea about I don't really like the idea of owning the plant. And you shared a story of a breeder who has worked really hard. He's found this very specific cannabinoid in this thing, and this could be his key to retirement. And Eleanor, you talked about the Nagoya Protocol, which I really appreciate. It's a document that I have not read fully yet and want to and need to. And it does talk about sort of this economic justice component to plants. And I think that both of these things are really interesting within the context of talking about ethics, which is something that we're thinking a lot about here in regards to that, you brought up economics, both of you, without realizing it, in the context of an ethical argument. So, as we think about, if capitalism or not capitalism is the right system to be working within and these ideas around ownership, we have to acknowledge that economics does have its own role to play with regards to what we think about what is good. And so as we talk about things next week in the workshop, I'm excited to sort of pick at that idea and bring it up because, even though we want to think about things in this pure way that has nothing to do with money, money and making sure that we are sustained within this current economic framework is something really important to consider. So I thank you both for your answers because they really spoke to that in a way that I heard and want to take with me. I'm glad that we got to spend some time on ideas because I know that's kind of the ideas for the future. And I'm glad that you brought up ideas from Kevin because I feel like there are a lot of ideas that are out there. And that sort of speaks to some ideas that both Eleanor and Trevor have brought up, which is that, Eleanor, you've brought up that we have, there are so many examples of things that exist out there that we can look to help us solve these problems within cannabis. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And as Trevor has pointed out, we don't have to get super complicated in the way that we think about this. We can get into the weeds, but it doesn't have to be super complicated. And then that speaks to this idea that Eleanor and I have spoken about before, which is this need for infrastructure. And so part of what I'm looking for as I think about, how is it that we all work together is looking at these pieces of infrastructure so that we can have a networked approach. And part of that infrastructure includes legal services, it includes licenses, it includes, as Steve has pointed out, it includes maybe something that's like a legal Zoom for cannabis breeders and growers for maybe their standard licenses. It includes an herbarium or herbaria. It includes multiple herbaria where we can actually go and reference these materials. It includes seed banks. It includes seed libraries. And, so to me, when I think about what is this resilient future that we need, it involves a network necessarily, right? And what's the glue that holds all of this together? Well, it's data and, and information and how we exchange information and how we exchange data. So that is the glue. And that is also part of why I feel like, oh my gosh, my battery's going to die in like 5 minutes. But I feel like that's, 22 minutes. That's great. But I feel like part of why to me, this conversation is so critical around data and how is that we share it is that, okay, so we've just had this thing where we experienced that like the way that we've been talking about and sharing data isn't quite right. Well, fine. I'm actually glad to have that information now. Now we can work with that and we can move through it. Because the way that we get these networks to work together is through the data, and we have to figure out the right way to handle it between one another so that we can have this resilient network and so that we can share information and so that we can rebuild the next thing. So next week is the beginning, is a conversation that I'll be hijacking the format on the podcast a little bit. And I hope, and I'm glad that that's consensual and okay, Stephen, thank you. Because I feel like we're all ready to figure out how it is that we can work together. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I look really forward to having that conversation and using that to build real ways to figure that out with all of you and to, put these technologies in place and to get them to work in ways that we've all dreamed of them working together, and we can do it. And I'm excited to do the work and really grateful to have the opportunity to do it with you. So thank you.
So are we assuming that we're announcing now that you are going to be on next Tuesday night also? We're going to have another follow-up?
Yeah.
Because nobody's announced it officially. So I
guess this is the official announcement. So next Tuesday here on the Potent Ponics podcast, something that, yay! I put out an announcement that we'll be doing a broader community discussion from 5 to 7. I'm now moving it from 6:30 to 8:30 to be part of Potent Ponics podcast. The idea is to hopefully I want to make this conversation as transparent as possible and to reach as many people in the growing and breeding community as possible. And I'm already talking to so many of the people on this podcast that I hope to be a part of that conversation. So if you're on this week's episode, I hope that you come back next week. And then we're hoping to invite some other people as well. And I hope that everyone will tune in, participate, be a part of the conversation. This is about, building the next chapter, and it will take all of us to be a part of it. And I hope, as people have mentioned, that we are really considering the international capabilities of our network as we are thinking about how we build this future and build, the other thing that I wanted to say is, Josh and Kelly from Dragonfly Earth Medicine, when they talk about doing their work, I really love the way that they talk about it. I know big heart, Roger, is for real, because they talk about building an alternative. This is not in competition. We need an alternative for the cannabis community. We need the infrastructure that fills the gaps that big for-profit cannabis and that the government has left out. There are a lot of gaps, and I want to do what we can to fill it. And so, yeah, anyway, thank you. That's all I have to say. And hope you all have a really great night.
Well, I'm sure it's going to be a great show next week too. I'll tell you what. So.
Well, why don't you tell everybody how to find you? I guess we'll wrap up the conversation on that note.
Cool.
We'll pick it up again next week. How do you on next Tuesday, at least on this particular conversation?
Yes.
How do people find you, Beth?
You can find me on Instagram at Beth Schechter, BethSchechter. You can also send me an email, beth.schechter@gmail.com. If you go to bethschechter.com/about and go to my bio, there's a link to a mailing list. And so I don't have a great URL for that now, sorry, but you can sign up for the mailing list, and that's kind of where I'm sending all of this stuff that I'm talking about too, and that on my Instagram. I'll also likely repost information about this to Open Cannabis Project's old Instagram channel, just to make sure that people get the news. So yeah, that's how to get in touch with me though. Beth Schechter stuff. Thanks.
So closed but not forgotten.
Right, closed but not forgotten. And it's an interesting thing because it's like, you know, like we're closed. And that organization is in the very final administrative steps of being gone, which is basically filing our taxes and sending in a 990, and that's it. But I know that people are interested in the conversation, and you know, it's funny. It's like the second that we close, a ton of people sign up for our Instagram account and also let us know that like, we're really sad that you're going away. And I hear that, and so I want to keep the channels open and keep the communication going. While also really making it clear that like that's a chapter that's very done. So yeah, closed but not forgotten.
I think we're all very, very happy that you came through with your head up, and you know, you and Dale been on the show before, and you did a great job of explaining everything. Yeah, we all want to be together building the new way. Make it, like we said, everybody's got to stop arguing. I wasn't part of an argument, but it's nice to be part of the whole team that's not arguing anymore.
Yeah, it's well, you know, it's, what is it, the oh, I'm trying to think of there's a quote on my computer that's upstairs. The first step of progress of any man or nation is discontent, you know, and you know, sometimes it takes having some kind of upheaval so that you can figure out the thing and move forward. And so it's been hard, but I'm grateful to be here and to be moving forward in an intentional and kind and heart-filled way.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, Beth, and helping put this together.
Thank you.
Do you have any final thoughts there, SunGrownMidz? And then how do people find you after your final thoughts?
Yeah. Basically, I think that there's a lot of good comments overall. I think there's surprisingly a lot of good stuff going on Instagram. Broadly speaking, like there are a lot of good people sharing a lot of good content. The discussion that happened around Phylos has kind of, not only like there have obviously been bad parts of it, there have been unnecessary bullying, and there have been issues that have arisen in the discourse that are things that we as a community and as a society constantly need to deal with and address. And other than that, there's been a lot of positives in the way that the discourse has unfolded and developed. I read just random ass news, business, cannabis news, and because I get every update whenever Phylos is in the news. And Phylos is basically used as like the example of what not to be, and the example of everything that is wrong in terms of the corporate takeover in the cannabis space. It's almost like a shorthand for like the way that Monsanto is used as a shorthand just to say shitty ag company doing bad stuff in the ag space. Phylos is shitty, you know, ag company in the cannabis space. And so I think that's a positive. And we also need to recognize that it goes beyond them. And it's really about differing economic models and priorities that are, you know, there's a local global dynamic to every struggle. And we just got to recognize that. And we got to adapt to this new crazy fucked up world. And it's fucked up on a lot of levels. Like prohibition was fucked up. Legalization's fucked up. World's fucked up. We're just thrown into a fucked up world trying to figure it out. And so let's be the best us we can be. And a lot of that's just figuring the shit out. Like we honestly have a lot of shit that we're just trying to figure out. And, you know, let's not lose the forest for the trees sort of thing, and just remember that there's a lot of struggles and history that have been built up in the past, and we can learn from those, and we can move forward in ways that hopefully actually protect our sort of like historic cultural traditions, because like, you know, that's what I'm about. I think it's sort of like, it's universal. It's something where I don't see my backwards ass Calaveras County pot growing self as disconnected from either historically or geographically from everybody else who made it possible for me to grow fire. Like, wouldn't be possible without everybody else who's made it so the genetic resources and the cultural conditions like flowed their way down to me, and I just happened to be in this time and this place to make use of it. And we just got to keep on making sure that other people have that opportunity too, and expand it as much as we can. That's kind of my jam. With that, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come on. I really appreciate all of you, and it was really a pleasure to be on a panel with each and every one of you. Like, good times. Thank you. Awesomeness. Yeah.
I just want to say on the phytos, it's a good thing it happened to all of us early on, just because we got to say it's basically early on. And, you know, you'd rather have that happen at the beginning of the game than the end of the game, you know. So, you know, and Trevor, you've been great. And so I know Steve wanted to know, how do people find you? And then
yeah. SungrownMidz is my Instagram. I also have elective affinities. There's some underscores in there. I don't know. SungrownMidz is the easiest way. Yeah, hit me up. Also, I've been handing out a file to people that's just a file of plant breeding resources. It's very general and it's very specific as well. So it covers just broad plant terminology, plant breeding, like introductory textbooks, all the way up to very advanced stuff. And there's also stuff that's very specific to cannabis. If you want that, hit me up with a DM on the Instagram. I will share that. It's got lots of resources in there. And yeah, I think that's something we just got to all get on the same page and be talking the same talk and working towards the same goals and objectives. And we'll be fine. We're better situated than a lot of other people and a lot of other struggle from the past. And we just got to remember what we do is awesome, and put value to remember the value in what we do and what we have done, and not lose sight of that. There's a reason people want cannabis, and part of that has to do with what we've done with it. And so let's not lose sight of that. Anyway, I can babble on forever, and so yeah.
Thanks a lot. Dale, do you have any final thoughts, and how do people find you? You're still muted down there.
There we go. Okay, great. Yeah, I just think my favorite thing about working in the cannabis industry is it's the people I meet. I've really enjoyed this panel. The ones of you that I've met in person, it's been great. I hope to meet the rest of you in person when I can. And yeah, I just feel really lucky to be able to do my part to help things, hopefully to help things get better and not worse in this industry. I am a lawyer, but I also really just care about people. I especially have come to respect plant breeders so much and what they put into their work. And so, whether they want a patent or not, whatever their goals are, I want to find a way to help them if I can, even if just advocating for certain things like more transparency and accountability and trust, or if it's advocating for natural rights for breeders, or if it's advocating for a patent pooling and patent defense system, whether people have patents or not, just in case they end up infringing somebody else's patent that ought to be taken down. I would like to be part of that. the places to find me, my law firm has a website, plantandplanet.com. That's also the Instagram handle for one of our Instagram pages. It's Plant and Planet with dots in between the words. So plant.and.planet. I blog at a website, plantlaw.com. And I try to blog as close as I can to every week, but sometimes I don't keep up with that. But it's meant to inform people who aren't lawyers about the way the law works and sometimes talk about policy. And then I also have another website that I started for reasons for some complicated reasons. I was hoping that we could kind of call out bad patents. And so I started a website called mjpatentsweekly.com. The idea was that people would see the patent, say hate, and comment on it, and we'd create this kind of crowdsourced mob mentality to go after these bad patents. That hasn't happened, but it's still kind of a cool website because it does update with new patents and new publications every week. It's clunky as hell because I got a bargain on putting the site together. So someday we're going to upgrade it and it's going to be great, but it does have over 11,000 patent documents on it.
It's so useful
20 or 30
if
or
you
more.
just want to see what is new in cannabis patents. I when I was at Open Cannabis Project, I used it all the time. It's a great resource in conjunction with some other search engines. So yeah, clunky, but like such a fucking great start. And like kudos to you for like putting your money where your mouth is and like just like fucking building that shit. So, you know, there you go.
Even if
It'll be
don't have, even if you don't have, well, clunky's all I can hear is clunky in my head now. But the fact is that you put out the information's out there now. It's regardless, there's a space to go get it. So thank you. And instead of injecting again later, I want to tell you, Dale, I've been sitting here through this whole night, and I know everybody respects the hell out of you. And I want to say the time you give to all of us, there's much respect. I swear I love it. I can't believe it because, I grew up in a kind of a legal, my mom was a paralegal, and I've been around the law a little bit, and lawyers don't just sit around and talk to people for free all the time. And I'll tell you what, you really impressed me a lot with all the information you shared. And you were hit hard tonight because I had a lot of people in chat really hitting with some great questions and all. So I just want to say, so I can back out, thank you so much for all the time you spend helping us out. Thank you.
Well, that means a lot. Thank you. That makes it, I mean, it's already worth it, but that's really great to hear. Thank you very much. So yeah, that MJ Patents Weekly, it's searchable. It's kind of weird. It's kind of cool. There's some really weird ass patents. The patent of the week this week is a cannabis leaf shaped personal pleasuring device. So go check that out. We have an Instagram, MJ Patents Weekly, as well. It's just MJ Patents Weekly. So, and then if you're like me and you love tequila, go to Tequila File. That's my personal Instagram. You'll see what I've been drinking lately. All right, I'm out.
I appreciate it. Thank you. What about you, Eleanor? Do you have any closing thoughts on how do people find you?
Well, I'll start with the easy one and tell everyone how to find me. Our website is leafworks.com, and our Instagram is the same thing. And for Candor, for the herbarium, it's just candor.org. And also Instagram is Candor Herbaria. So that's how you can find me. And it's been really great to be here. I respect everyone on this panel. I've had a lot of conversations with everyone who's a guest tonight, so it's nice to be able to come together and converse in one space. So thank you for holding that space for us. And yeah, I'm really here for the plants. And then secondarily, all the people who take care of those plants. So it's really, really nice for me to be in a group that understands not only the importance of the economic value of this plant, but also the deep history and the cultural richness that comes from our medicinal plant community as a whole, and in particular, this very special plant that has a very powerful spokesman role for the rest of the medicinal plants. So that makes me really happy. And it is one of the things that continues to inspire me about this community, that, you know, on the surface, it's all about cannabis and she's queen. But then once you dig a little deeper, you know, there's a lot of love and connection for the rest of the plants, especially those medicinals that have carried us so far, both culturally and physically as a species. So I really appreciate that. And yeah, find me on Instagram or on our websites, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Awesome. Appreciate it. What about you, Roger? Do you have any closing thoughts on how people find you?
Sorry, I was muted. I was across the room. I had to go do something real quick. You can find me at ilovegrowingmarijuana.com, as always. Roger Latewood at Instagram or Facebook. We're working on something more suitable. In fact, I really want to get a thing going where we have all of us that are panelists and all of our guests in some kind of place. You know, I'd like to have a place like that. Yeah, that goes back to what Dale was talking about too, with having that collective. I want to say something about that idea of putting in funds and putting in percentages of money to have a legal defense fund. I think that's an extraordinarily good idea, because like he said, it won't be going against a farmer or a collective from a county. It'll be going against an international group with some money in the bank. So that's about all I got to say tonight on that. And you can find me here Tuesdays and Thursdays pretty much.
All right. What about you, Tara? Any closing thoughts on how do people find you?
Well, it's nice seeing you guys again. Last time was the Cultivation Classic I ran in a couple of years, so that was cool. Nice seeing Beth again. You guys all had such great information. Eleanor, the first time I met you, wow, woo, knowledge, whoa, going on. So, wow, thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. I'm Tara Lee Live. I have a YouTube channel and an Instagram account. And I just try and keep up on all this cannabis stuff. And thanks, Steve, for the invite. And I appreciate everybody showing up in chat. Thanks for the support. Oh,
can I say one more thing? Since Tara was waving, I do want to thank Beth, who's always a darling to be on the show, and Eleanor. I do, I'm sorry for not saying something about you guys. You were great tonight. The international knowledge from Eleanor. It was really nice meeting you, and I appreciate that too. Trevor, nice having you on the show again. Yeah, and I can babble on too, as you all know. But anyway, if you got anything else to say, Tara, I'll give it back to you.
All right, and I just wanted to thank everybody for taking the time to come on the podcast. It means a lot, and I really appreciate everyone taking the time to educate, the wider community and doing these types of events, be it on here or different, events in person or conferences and what have you. I very much appreciate everyone taking the time and, trying to solve these issues, not by just screaming at each other online or doing these other stuff, but actually having civilized discussions with people that know what they're talking about and can actually address these in a way that actually have legal ramifications, not necessarily legal advice, but how to actually protect yourself in a legal way that's smart and to move forward in a way that isn't all screwed up and to not go down the wrong path and learn the wrong lessons from what's happened earlier this year and even in previous years, how to better protect ourselves, because we've all worked very hard and people have been raising, certain people's families have been raising stuff for 3-4 generations. They don't want to lose that hard work. So, this really goes to the core of that and a lot of people's, larger fears of what's actually going on in the industry or what could happen to the industry. And I think we've addressed a lot of the bigger issues, and it'll be great to hear next week where we try to get to the core of some other issues as well. So really appreciate both Beth taking the time and SungrownMidz and Dale and Eleanor and everyone taking the time to really get to the heart of these questions. So I appreciate it. And you guys can find me at Ponics on YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, all the different places. We're getting real close to getting the farm online. We got the first plants up there this week, so that'll be awesome. And yeah, we'll have a lot more content from there in the next week or so. So lots of other cool stuff happening we'll have available to talk about next week. And yeah, we'll have some cool stuff going on Thursday. So we'll see you guys on Thursday. We'll have a shorter episode than usual, but yeah, we'll be a normal episode on Thursday. It's a little bit shorter. So we'll catch you guys again next week. Cheers.
Thanks, Joel.